This is part 2 of the logical fallacies videos. In this video, we're talking about fallacies of logical arguments. Your textbook, Everything's an Argument, divides fallacies into emotional, ethical, and logical arguments, but really there's lots of overlap. Of course, logical fallacies can be really effective, especially when people aren't paying attention. So just because you see a fallacy here does not mean you're not going to see this fallacy in speeches, in advertisements, commercials, social media posts. They can be persuasive when people aren't really thinking with their conscious minds. Hopefully, we're able to identify logical fallacies and then also avoid logical fallacies or errors in reasoning in our own essays and in our own arguments. Let's talk about hasty generalization. This one's relatively straightforward. The title means what you think it would mean. Making assumptions about a whole group or a range of cases based on a sample that's not adequate for some reason. So maybe it's too small, or maybe it's not really a representative sample. So with this type of fallacy, there might be some stereotyping involved, or the sample size might be too small. And of course, whether or not a sample size is adequate as a whole field, you can study, something you can study more in a statistics class, but for our purposes, we're not going to get too much into that. Let's take a look at this example of a sample that's really large, but it's not really representative. So 100,000 voters from Orange County, California were surveyed on their choice of governor, and 68% said that they intended to vote for the Republican candidate. Clearly, the Republican candidate will be elected. So yes, there's a big sample size, 100,000 people, but this is coming from Orange County, California. So it's not representing all of California. Orange County, at least typically, tends to skew more Republican, more conservative. So this might not be a representative sample, even though the sample size is large. So we want to beware of the fallacy of hasty generalization. The next is called post hoc, or after this, therefore, because of this. You've probably heard of this one before. This fallacy is pretty famous. So arguing that because one action follows another, the first causes the second. You can certainly make causal arguments, right? There's a whole chapter in your textbook about causal arguments. We're reading lots of causal arguments, but you would have to actually make that connection clear, right? That one thing caused the other. You would have to support that. So just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that one caused the other. Correlation is not the same thing as causation. So for example, President Jones raised taxes and then the rate of violent crime went up. Jones is responsible for the rise in crime. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, right? So this is the post hoc fallacy. The next one is begging the question. People use this term a lot in a much more informal way that's not quite correct. Begging the question is the logical fallacy of either using circular reasoning or ignoring an important assumption on which the argument rests, or asking the reader to accept a conclusion without good enough evidence. So it can encompass a lot of different kind of sub-fallacies. Let's take a look at this first one. Consuming meat is unethical because it's morally wrong to eat animals. Well, that's just basically saying the same thing. Yes, it's using different words, but more or less it's just saying the same thing, right? So the conclusion is really the same thing as the premise, so it's not working as an argument. Murder is morally wrong. This being the case, it follows that abortion is morally wrong. So this one is ignoring the important assumption. The sentence is clearly assuming that abortion is murder, but it hasn't established that. So again, this fallacy can involve just sort of repeating the same idea, basically saying A equals A, not giving solid evidence and asking us to accept the conclusion, or ignoring a key assumption. Equivocation. So people say that you're equivocating. It might mean that you're shifting between two meanings. And of course, you can do this to be funny, to kind of make a play on words. But if you're doing this with the intent to deceive, or if the rhetorician or the writer or the speaker is doing it with an intent to deceive, then this would be the fallacy of equivocation. So some triangles are obtuse. Whatever is obtuse is ignorant. Therefore, some triangles are ignorant. So obviously that one hinges on the double meaning of obtuse, meaning an angle that's like this. I think that's the opposite of acute, also being ignorant or stupid. Giving money is the right thing to do, so charities have the right to our money. Now, it's really catchy, right, to use words in this way where they have two meanings. But when the intention here is to deceive us, to make us not realize that the word right has two meanings here and it's being used differently, then that would be a problem. Non sequitur. This means it does not follow. The conclusion does not follow the premise. and the evidence does not support the claim, or it's totally irrelevant. A lot of times people will say this in conversation if somebody brings up something that seems irrelevant to the conclusion. So LACMA is the best museum in Los Angeles because it has the widest variety of art. Therefore, LACMA should take over operations of other local museums. Well, the first sentence, it makes a good point that it's the best museum, and here's the reason why it's the best museum. But what comes after it doesn't really have anything to do with the premise, right? The two are not connected. It's a non sequitur. Let's take a look at straw man. So think of a straw man as a scarecrow, right? You fluff up a scarecrow with a lot of straw. Well, when you do that with an argument, it means you take somebody else's argument, you take out all the complexity, all the nuance, you simplify it, you oversimplify it, you fluff it up with straw. So it's really hollow and emptied out, and then you attempt to push it over. Well, to people who aren't paying attention, it might look like you've dismantled the argument. But to someone who's paying attention, they'll say, wait a minute, that isn't really a fair representation of the other point of view or of your opposition. It's a straw man, right? You're watering down and weakening the argument. So feminists want to ban all pornography and punish everyone who looks at it. That's probably not the feminist argument here, right? It's probably something more complicated than that. Or members of the GOP are waging war on women. Well, probably it's not just that Republicans want to wage a war on women. So be careful of arguments that oversimplify the counter argument or the other point of view. Red herring. So a herring is a type of fish. A herring can be used to distract a hound dog when it's searching for whatever it is that it's searching for, quail or something else people are hunting for, because the herring is really stinky. So think of this as some sort of part of the sentence or paragraph that's diverting our attention or changing the subject without us realizing it. So something like grading the exam on a curve would be the fair thing to do. After all, classes go more smoothly when the professor and students are getting along well. Well, first this seems like a decent argument, but then we realize we're talking about fairness and grading. This point about the professor and students getting along, that's really tangential to the argument, right? It's not connected to fairness, because it's certainly possible to have a class that is very fair, but the professor and the students aren't getting along well. So the second part of that is a tangent. It's designed to kind of get us thinking about something else. Faulty analogy. So, of course, using analogies can be a really effective tool, but you want to make sure that the two things that you're comparing are alike in the fundamental respects, in the areas that are really important. Otherwise, it can be sort of a funny line or an interesting analogy, but it might be a fallacy. So the analogy is not strong enough to support the conclusion, or the two things being compared aren't really alike in ways that matter. So politicians and diapers must be changed often and for the same reason. That's really funny. That's really catchy. But of course, those two things, one is a diaper, one is a human. Those two things don't have a lot in common. Vaping in a restaurant is like texting in a restaurant, and yet few restaurants would ask someone texting their friend to leave. This one I was sort of on the fence with, because I can see how vaping and texting in some ways are quite similar. They're things that might be considered an annoyance or slightly distracting to people around, but they shouldn't really have too much of an impact on the people sitting around you in a restaurant. So at first I thought, oh, this is a pretty good analogy here. Although there's some big distinctions, right? With texting, there is nothing being emitted into the air, and with vaping, something is being emitted into the air, and also there's a smell involved. So those two things aren't alike in fundamental ways, so it's probably not a good analogy. Just like comparing, say, a gun to a hammer when talking about violence or mass violence, that might not actually be the best analogy, because one is a tool and the other is a weapon, and then also one can inflict mass carnage and the other can certainly be used as a weapon, but not at a distance. So it's important to consider that the things that you're comparing have enough in common, and that the analogy is strong enough to support the conclusion. Paralipsis. So saying that you will not talk about something, and then you're actually bringing up the topic that you said you weren't going to talk about that. People do this all the time in conversation too. It's sort of a passive-aggressive technique. I will not bring up my opponent's outrageous wealth since that would be tacky, right? You can see how this can sort of be funny depending on the situation. Here's a really famous example from Ronald Reagan in one of the debates. I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. So of course, this can be sort of funny and it can be effective, but if you're breaking it down just on the level of argument, it is a fallacy, right? Because you're saying that you won't talk about it, but then you're actually talking about it. You're bringing it up. And then finally, appeal to ignorance. This is suggesting that a proposition is true because it has not been proven false, or suggesting the conclusion is false because it hasn't been proved true. So here's an example of that. Since no one objected to the proposal, we can assume that everyone agrees with the proposed changes, right? So there's no evidence of people objecting to it, so everyone must agree with it. But there are several other scenarios, right? It's very possible that many people object to it, but they didn't want to raise the objections because of fear of punishment. It's very possible that they didn't understand the proposal. There are certainly other possibilities here. So appeal to ignorance can work both ways. Here's a list of some of the works I've consulted. Obviously, there's much more about this and some more complicated examples in the pages on Canvas below this video. So take a look at those. And you might also want to read the corresponding chapter in the textbook. Hope that helps.